Hello everybody and welcome to the Talia Chester YouTube channel. This is the first video on the channel and hopefully the first of many videos to come. Today we're going to be having a look over the head-to-head record between Gukesh D and Ding Liren, the two contenders for the World Chess Championship of 2024. On one side, we've got Ding Liren, former world number 2, and also the person with the second longest unbeaten streak in chess history, both of those just behind Magnus Carlsen. They've been on a bit of a bad streak at the moment, haven't been winning that many games. They've slipped from something like second in the world to about 20th place, which is a real shame because they're an excellent player, and hopefully they're going to be able to bounce back in time for this World Championship. On the other side, we have Gukesh. Gukesh is one of the rising stars of the Indian team, aged just 18. They're currently 5th in the world, which is incredibly high for someone of that age. They dominated the candidate tournament with just one loss, which is absolutely incredible. And yeah, so they're one of the emerging people in this Indian powerhouse with the likes of Prague and Erigaisi in that setup as well. In their head-to-head games, so far I can find 4 games that they've played together. There is one other game of Chess 960 that I'm not going to cover because it's not a traditional chess format. And in these games, obviously we're going to have a look at them today. You're going to see some excellent chess from both sides, and we will see how that goes after we analyse these games. So this first game we have here, it starts off with c4 as shown here. First of all, it goes on e6, knight c3, d5, and we transpose very quickly into a queen's gambit setup. After bishop to e7, this goes into the Charasek variation of the queen's gambit. Basically, the aim for black here is just to develop their pieces as quickly as possible and get their kingside castled very quickly. After takes, bishop to f4 and c6, we kind of go into what looks like a semi-Slav setup with an exchange on d5. e3 is played, bishop to f5, and here we have a very aggressive move of g4. This is opening theory here, and black moves back to e6. The point of this move for black, as you can see, they might have been able to play bishop to e6 straight away, but g4 is an induced weakness for white. If they can't use it for a good attack, it means that black might be able to attack it later on and be able to use that as a weakness. Whereas for white, they're going to hope to try and push that pawn and use it as an advantage on the king side, most likely, trying to form some kind of kingside attack. White now has 2 options basically what to play. h4 is one of the moves that is commonly played here, and basically the aim of this is to continue on with that attack with moves like h4 and g5 and the likes of that. Here you can see in this variation, en passant takes comes in here. And basically the aim is that white's kind of opened up their king side to try and get some kind of attack going. However, in this game, it's not what was chose. h3 instead is chose, and this is the same move order that was played in a game between Ding Liren and Anish Giri as well. So very, very top level stuff this is, obviously. Knight to d7, just continuing development for the black pieces. Knight to f3. Another advantage of playing h3 is the fact that if h4 is played, the queen will be the only defender of the g4 pawn, so knight to f3 or to e2 could not be played. However, with that pawn being there, knight f3 is viable. Knight to f6 and bishop to d3, just standard opening development moves. And here is a move that leaves opening theory with c5. c5 actually does not have to be taken in this position. If the pawn decides to push to attack our bishop, we can just simply slide it back. And then this pawn here is going to be very weak. It's got no pawns beside it, which means it is a backwards pawn. Same thing kind of goes if this pawn is taken in the center. The knight will just recapture, and the knight is going to be outposted on that square. And this pawn is going to be incredibly weak for the rest of the game. However, white does decide to take the pawn, the knight recaptures, and then the bishop comes in to give a check on the black king. The bishop quickly comes back to protect it, and here there's an option of 2 different moves again. The more aggressive one of these, I think, is playing g5. As you can see, the black knight will have to move, and this sequence, after a couple of exchanges, does manage to win a pawn. So exchange there, and then this pawn on d5 is won. So here you can see Ding Liren is a pawn up. After the rook goes to attack the knight comes in to attack the king, and the king would have to go over to f8. And after a quick exchange of queens and castling kingside, this would be the position. As you can see, the engine says this position is very equal. However, the pawn advantage for white is not felt too much. As you can see, the black knights in the center 2 squares are very, very well placed. and the rook here has got this open file and is attacking this knight. On white's side, their pieces are slightly offside. This knight has no real reason for being here other than to move this king out the way. These pawns are very weak and can be attacked later on, and honestly, it's going to be a very even game from this point on. I think it's a slightly more aggressive line than what was played, which was castles here. After castles and castles, rook to c1 tries to take that open file, and rook c8 counterattacks that same open file. Queen to e2 completing development for white, and the knight comes into e4. Here, the knight recaptures on e4. If it doesn't capture, then the knight will capture here, and the pawn on c3 will become isolated, which we do not want. So captures, hold on, captures, knight comes into the center here. And here, again, we have an option of two different moves. And the engine very much likes this move for the next couple of moves of h5, being very, very aggressive in these center squares. Obviously, you can't capture the pawn back because this bishop will come in and just completely devastate white's kingside. However, g5 is still an option here. It's not the same as before, where knight d5 comes in and then a couple of exchange... Oh, sorry, the queen comes and takes this pawn. However, after a couple of exchanges, you can see here, what the key move here is black's queen is able to come to d2, attacking both this pawn here and the rook here. And this pawn is about to fall now, and it's going to be quite an even game. However, white's queen is very offside here, and this pawn is very weak. Also, white has got the advantage of having the open file. However, this can be challenged pretty much straight away. So black has a slight advantage here. But they did not choose to go for that. Instead, went for knight to d5. After bishop to e5, there is a exchange of pieces. The rooks try and take the open file, and a quick exchange happens. And here we get a lot of pieces traded off, including this queen trade, which I think was a very good move here, because it gets all of white's pieces very active, and it's able to use the advantage of black's inactivity to their advantage. Here, a6 is played, and I think a6 is a very bad move here. As you see, I've marked with a question mark. Mainly because of the white's next move of knight to d6, and this pawn is going to be very difficult to defend later on. Even if it's pushed, this pawn's going to become weak, this pawn's going to become weak. It's going to be very difficult for white to defend, for black to defend it. After rook to d8, the knight recaptures on b7. And rook to b8 confounds these problems, and it allows for this rook infiltration on c7. White's pieces are incredibly active here, and you can see we've got a 2-on-1 on the queen side, and white is most likely able to get a passed pawn in this position. After knight to d5, and rook attacks the knight on d5. The knight comes into a4, and the key move of a3, just making sure that black cannot try and capture this pawn, and then pawn to b4. You can see here that black hasn't really got much going on in this position. This knight is in a pretty bad situation. It's not really doing too much, and it can't get to these pawns to attack them. This rook is stuck attacking this knight, and as soon as it moves, this pawn will be gone. So in this position, black's position is not that good, especially considering white is a pawn up and threatening to have a passed pawn. After the knight comes to e5, an interesting move here of rook to d8, offering this trade of rooks. It's not necessary to offer this trade of rooks. You can just move your rook to another square, still protecting this knight. Obviously, that's not what white wanted to go for, though, so they opted to exchange. It's not a bad move in any way, shape, or form. It's just a different way of playing. The knight comes into c4, and obviously you have to make sure that pawn is not taken. The knight comes into b6, and then b5 is able to guarantee a passed pawn. Obviously, you can't protect this pawn on a4 now, so you've got to do an exchange. So knight to b7, knight takes a4, and knight takes a5. And now this pawn here is just going to be incredibly powerful in this endgame, being able to push forward and hopefully being able to win the game for white. Black plays king to f8, and here white plays the move knight to c4. It's not a bad move at all. However, black's king always wants to come to e7 in this kind of position. Playing knight to c6 might be slightly more accurate because it stops this king from coming in. Obviously, the reason why you play knight to c4 is to protect this square and allow this pawn to push, and also to have ideas of coming to attack this pawn later on as well. King comes into e7, as I previously said. h4 is played, just gaining some space on that king side. King to e6, and then b6. Here, the engine, what it really wants is for white king to get involved. So playing g2, g3, and king f4. However, after b6, knight to c5, knight to a5 is played, and now there's going to be more advantage when pushing this pawn. The king plays into d5, and the king plays up to g2, trying to get into the game a bit more. The knight attacks the pawn, and now b7 is played. There is only one more square to go until promotion happens. The king comes to c5. The king comes to g3, and here it's a very important decision here for black. What do they play? Do they play king to b5 to kick the knight out of the way, or do they play king to b6 to try and win this pawn? Now, the correct move here is not king to b6, because of the knight being able to come to c4, and after the capture, the knight is able to come to d6. The best move in this position is to play king to b5. With king to b5, now the knight has to move out of the way, and then king to b6 can be played without that threat anymore. However, king to b6 is played, and white regains that large advantage, and after knight plays to here and the king captures that b7 pawn, the white king is able to come to f4 and attack this pawn. As you can see, there is a fork here with the knight, and it is the best move to play, but we'll have a look at that in just a second. Actually, I'll have a look at it now, actually. So knight to d6 is played. King to c6, there are three options of what to play, of taking this pawn, or playing here to fork these pawns here. If knight takes e4 is played, this is a bad move because the king can start coming into the position and it's a lot easier for black to defend. Knight takes f7 is the move that's going to be played in the game in just a second. It is a very good move here. It's just not the most accurate. The most accurate move here is to play knight to f5, attacking these two pawns, completely destabilizing black's kingside pawns. However, in the game, we can see king f4 is played, and then after knight c5, this move is eventually played, and knight takes f7 is played. King to d5 comes in, and king to f5 is played. Knight to d3 is played, and here is the key moment of the game. This f2 pawn is hanging, yet there's not much that white can particularly do about it. White needs to try and create a passed pawn here in some kind of way, and they need to figure out the best way of being able to do it. The best move in this position is h5, allowing this pawn to be taken. And after the knight takes this pawn, white can recapture the pawn on h6, which is a brilliant move here for sacrificing this knight, allowing for this passed pawn. Black's knight cannot be able to get back in time to defend these squares over here. So after this and h6, white will manage to promote their pawn. However, in the game, what is actually played instead is knight takes h6 straight away, which is a game, not losing, but game drawing mistake. Because after captures, and then the pawn is pushed, and after captures, you can see here that the difference in the two positions is that black has never had to move their knight to capture this f2 pawn, and instead the king can come back, and then the knight can come into e5, and this is a drawing endgame. As white plays pawn to g6, black checks the king, and after king to f7, king to e5, it ends up being a repetition of moves. White can try and get any further with this with a move like king to g6, but ideas of moving the king into the position and just sacrificing the knight at some point to win this pawn, or just winning the pawn outright, just stop white from being able to make any progress in the position. So here, white decides to take the draw here. Obviously, this can be quite disappointing for Ding. Obviously, Gukesh was only 15 at the time of this game. As you can see, there were only 2, 5, 7, 8 rated. Well, I say only as if that's like nothing. But yeah, very, very well fought game from Gukesh there to try and come back from that losing position. White played very, very well as well, managed to get into that winning position, but just lost it at the last second. We're going to go into game 2 now and see how that goes. This second game, Ding Liren is playing as black and Gukesh is playing as white. Starts off with d4, knight f3, and goes into a Queen's Indian defense. It's not so often seen at the top level anymore, at least as far as I'm aware. G3 is played and bishop to a6 comes on the board. This is a very common idea in the Queen's Indian, playing bishop to a6 to try and provoke a move like b3 to protect that c pawn, and then just moving back to b7. Doesn't have to be done straight away though. As you can see, bishop comes in for a quick check here, and the bishop plays to d2, and the bishop goes straight back. Normally the knight might want to be on that d2 square, and that bishop might have to move a second time to, let's say, c c3 or something along those lines, which is the reason why you give that check first and then come straight back. Bishop to g2 comes on the board. Castles, and then d5. Now, there are two main moves here, which is the pawn that captures on d5 and then recaptures, or knight comes into e5 as well. These are the two main ideas in this opening. However, white decides here to play knight to c3, a slightly odd move. The reason being is because c6 is able to be played, and then after the c pawn decides to capture, instead of the e pawn being forced to take back, instead of the e pawn capturing back, the c pawn is then able to take back instead. Slight difference in variation there. Instead, bishop to f4 is played, and then after knight to d7 captures, and then black opts to capture with the e pawn instead of capturing with that c pawn. The knight now comes back to e1. This is where we kind of leave opening theory. In these kind of positions, as I said before, knight to e5 is a lot more common. And they go for this reroute of putting the knight on d3 instead, opening up this bishop diagonal as well. The knight comes into f8. The bishop comes to g5, and the knight comes to attack this bishop, and white gives up the bishop pair here. And the move e3 is played. So basically, opening development is kind of finished. Black has a very slight advantage because of their bishop pair. Knight c5 is played. Looks like it's just a hanging piece here, but obviously you've got this bishop on f6 coming to attack this c3 knight. After takes, the rook comes over, the queen protects the bishop, the queen attacks the bishop, and then the pawn defends this bishop. White then opts to take this b6 pawn, which I think is a slightly odd move. According to the engine, it is the best move. However, I would have thought that opening this rook on a8, opening the line of attack to this a2 pawn, might be a little bit risky, with ideas of obviously taking this knight. Obviously, it can't be done straight away, but obviously taking this knight, and then queen recaptures, and the rook comes down to a2. The rook comes to d1, however, to defend that knight from that attack. And the rook decides to not stay on that a file and instead come to those center squares, which are going to be very vital in this game. After captures, the knight comes to f4, which I think is a very odd move. And I think, in my opinion, this is almost a game-losing move at this point. The reason being, after g5, which is a very aggressive move, maybe a little bit difficult to spot or see how powerful it is, the knight comes to h5, obviously not just wanting to go back to the same square it started off on. And then after the queen comes to h6, the bishop is forced to protect this knight. And this knight now has not got much left to do in this game. It's in a kind of really bad position. It can't really move to any of its squares. And this bishop is now stuck defending that knight until further notice. The pawn pushes to c5 to protect that bishop in the center. g4 is then played to stop the move g4 coming in from black at any point, and also to protect that knight so the bishop is able to move. f5 comes in, and here knight to g3 is played. After captures, the knight comes in for an intermezzo attack on the queen. The queen comes to f6, obviously just getting out of the way of that attack. And instead of recapturing that pawn on g4, white opts to play bishop to e4 instead, trying to start some kind of attack on that h pawn. h5 is played straight away, and then b4 is played. The idea in this position should be to try and block this bishop up, because as you can see, black's pieces are incredibly well positioned for an attack. You can see that the bishops are all coming down here. These rooks are both on very nice open files, and this queen is going to be able to join the attack very soon. So what white needs to try and do is block all of this attack trying to come in. Even these pawns here are very well positioned for some kind of attack. King to f8 is played. I'm not 100% sure why this move was played. It looks a little bit odd to me. And a3 is played, which is the wrong move here. a4 is absolutely vital here to be able to stop this bishop from staying on its square, and then pushing b5 to stop that attack there. But however, a3 is played, h4 is played, and then rook to e1 comes in. And we have a brilliant move here of rook takes e4 coming onto the board. This move looks very odd, especially to start with, because you just think, can't my queen just recapture? If this happens, bishop to d3 comes on the board. Again, another hanging piece here. If the queen here decides to take this bishop is able to capture this pawn here, checking the king and attacking the queen, just winning it outright. So they can't play that. Instead, they have to move the queen out of the way, and after a quick exchange, bishop takes knight. You might be thinking, why couldn't they take this rook with the other rook here? It's the exact same idea of the bishop coming in to d3 here. The queen still can't recapture because of the bishop moving here, and if the queen decides to move, this rook will just be won. So as we can see here, we get this sequence of bishop takes here, not bishop takes there, of queen to e6, the queen captures, the rook captures, and the bishop captures on f5. And although at the end of the sequence, black is only a pawn up, they have both the bishop pair, still a very strong attack on this king side with these pawns, and in the end of the day, this pawn is just going to fall after this. And black even opts not to even recapture this pawn straight away because it's going to be hanging at any point. And bishop to h3 is played, and here Gukesh resigns. So this is the first decisive game of these two players. And as black here, I think that was an absolute masterclass, playing at such a high accuracy there, of showing how to really get all your pieces involved in the attack of the game. And I think it was just an incredible performance there from black. We're going to be moving on to game 3 now, and let's see if Gukesh is going to be able to bounce back in this position. Here we can see Gukesh playing as the white pieces and Ding Liren playing as the black pieces. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6. This is the Italian game, going into a quiet variation with c3. Note that white decided not to push d4 yet. This is a little bit more aggressive. However, this move, c3, gets into a lot more theoretical games. d6, a4, with the idea of pushing at b4, trying to make sure this bishop gets trapped here. a5 is played to stop the move b4 and allowing this bishop to have a square to move back to. Bishop to g5, h6, bishop to h4. And here we have a little option here. g5 is more common nowadays. It's a lot more common to try and be more aggressive here, forcing the bishop backwards. However, in the game, bishop to a7 was chosen instead, which is a lot less aggressive in the grand scheme of things. Knight to a3 is played. Queen to e7 and knight to b5, getting on an almost outposted square there. Obviously, the c-pawn is there to attack it, but the knight is going to have to move out of the way first. It's just quite a nice square for that bishop, that knight to be on. It also attacks that bishop that was on a7, which is why it had to move. The queen comes into b3 to attack the f7 square, and g5 is played. Bishop to g3 comes on the board and castles the king. And here we can see it's going to be a very aggressive game because white castles queenside. A very, very exciting decision here. Obviously, with opposite side castling, it means that it's more likely that it's going to be a very back and forth attacking game with lots of tactics being involved. As you can see, white here most likely will be wanting to play stuff along the lines of h4. And for black, they're going to be trying to open up that king side as quickly as possible. Knight to h5 comes on the board, just making sure that bishop gets traded off if it wants to. And d4 is played, taking that center square now instead of a lot earlier on. And captures, knight captures here. It's actually technically better to capture with the f3 knight than it is the b5 knight. And as you can see, if the move bishop takes d4 is played here, the knight then recaptures on d4, and the queen is able to win the e4 pawn. So that is just a straight win of a pawn there if black wants it. However, black instead goes for the variation which starts off with g4. Forcing this knight to go to the side of the board, unless white finds a move, knight takes c6, bringing their knight into the center. And in this position, you'd actually think that black was still going to win that pawn. However, this is not the case. So after captures and rook captures, even though that pawn manages to attack that rook to stop that pawn from being defended, after queen takes, there is a fork here with the queen and rook. It's not losing in any way for white here. There's moves that they can be played to keep the advantage. However, if we just go back, instead knight to h4 is played. Maybe missing that move, maybe they just decided against it, not 100% sure. After captures and pawn captures, the queen is able to capture this pawn and really open up this center of the board. This king here is now going to be very weak for the rest of this game. You can see here that it cannot run over to this side of the board because of this very well positioned queen, and the pawns in front of the king are non-existent basically. The rook comes in to attack the queen, and the queen comes back to h7, maintaining that diagonal, which is very, very important. And here, bishop to d3 can be played to attack the queen straight away. Instead, rook to d2 is played, trying to double up on that e-file. Bishop to d7 is played, and now bishop to d3 is played instead. The queen is then played to g7, and the bishop is played into f5, offering that exchange of bishops. Queen comes into g5, and the queen comes into b5 to protect this knight instead. The rook comes in to e8, and this is a very vital moment of the game for white. They basically got two options here. Do they take this rook and after recapturing play this knight back into the position, really stopping any threats of the rook coming down here? Neither knight can really attack this knight and be in a comfortable position here. And after captures, we've got a couple moves that we played here, like knight to a7. And this is a even position here, making sure that white regains that advantage from earlier. However, instead of this, white elects to play rook to e3, which I think is a fatal mistake here, mainly because black does not have to recapture this rook and bring this knight back into the position. Knight to g7 is played, and an exchange quickly happens, and the pawn is played to d5, stopping any trades going on between these two queens. White had the opportunity to be able to recapture this pawn here, but has elected against it. Not sure if that's the right decision. Obviously, they're just trying to stop any ideas of rook to b8 coming in, and there being a very aggressive attack on this pawn. Black's pieces would be very, very active here. Rook takes, pawn takes, and then the knight is able to move. And as you can see here, every piece is going to start coming into the attack here for black. The rook is going to come over to e8, attacking this pawn. This knight's going to come to a2, and most likely this queen's going to try and get back onto this diagonal here, stopping the king from being able to escape. Queen takes b7 comes a little too late here, because black is able to carry on their attack right now. The bishop comes back to attack the queen, and the queen gets onto that file of that diagonal. And very quickly, the black king is going to get very overwhelmed here. Black queen tries to come back in time, but after knight to a2, king to d1, queen to b1, king to e2, and the key move, queen to g1. Black's king is absolutely in the middle of the sticks right now. It's going to be very difficult for black to be able to defend it here. King to d3 is played, which is an inaccuracy. Obviously, they're trying to avoid any ideas of knight c1 checkmate. So king to d3 is played, and then knight to b4 is played. The king moves up into the center. You never want your king in the center in these kind of positions. And you can see that every piece is doing something in the attack here to make sure that the white king is going to be checkmated very, very soon. Queen to e1 is played. The rook comes into d3, basically sacrificing itself, but the knight is worth more than the rook in this position. It's not worth black recapturing here. Queen comes into e2 to attack that rook, and after rook to c3, queen to d2, there is checkmate in 10 moves. I know it says 15 up here, but it is checkmate in 10 moves. And after king to c4 and rook to e4, white resigns the game. This is 2 losses for Gukesh in a row here. So it's currently 2 games to 2.5 points to Ding Liren, only half a point to Gukesh. This was a very difficult game here. Gukesh never really had the advantage, and Ding Liren played incredibly well throughout the entire affair. It shows very easily how queenside castling can go wrong if you're not able to defend yourself well enough, and you need to be a lot quicker on the counterplay in these kinds of games. Final game coming up now. We'll see if Gukesh can manage to regain his composure and manage to get a point, or whether Ding Liren will continue the winning streak and be able to win this final game. In this game, Gukesh has the black pieces, Ding Liren has the white pieces, and we start off with e4 as we did in the previous game. And this opening is basically the exact same thing from the previous game. c3 is played going into the quiet game yet again. And a5 is played here to stop the move b4 from coming in from white. Rook to e1 is played, very common in these kind of positions. Castles, h3 just stopping the knight or the bishop coming from that key g4 square. Bishop offers a trade on e6, which white quickly declines, goes to attack that knight on c6 instead, which often is a little bit of a problem for the ideas of moving d4 into the center squares. Obviously, black can now move that bishop back to e7 to protect that knight, but it's now taken 2 moves to do that instead of white moving bishop to b5 straight away. Bishop to a7 is played, and an exchange on e3 comes on. These are all very common ideas in this opening. The knight comes back to e7, and the pawn is pushed to d4, taking control of those center squares. This is very important in an Italian game like this. Obviously, you can play d4 a lot earlier on, as I said earlier, but white opts to delay it until this move now. Knight to g6 is played, reactivating that knight going towards that king side, and the bishop comes back to protect the king. The bishop wasn't doing too much on that b5 square, so it was kind of optimal to place it back on that f1 square. d5 busts open the center of the board, and there's going to be a lot of exchanges happening in just a second. The knight comes in to protect the pawn on e4, and after the knight captures the e5 pawn. After captures, obviously there's a lot to analyse here, but it's going to be quite difficult to do in a short time format. The pawn gets pushed to c5, taking kingside space. Rook lift is now complete, with the rook going to g3, going to try and attack that king side of the board, and d4 is played. Obviously, in this position, white wants to be playing queen to h6, trying to attack that king side. So queen to h4 was the technical best move there, stopping that from coming into position. Obviously, black would have seen that was white's plan, but opted against it, thinking that maybe it wasn't strong enough of a threat to worry about. But d5 is played, queen to h6 comes on the board, and g6 is played, stopping that checkmating threat. Here, rook to e1 is the best move in the position, just getting that rook into the game. Going to play rook to e4, rook to h4, stuff like that, just trying to get all your pieces active and involved. However, white decides to play bishop to d3 here instead, stopping that pawn on d4 from being able to push any further into the position, and also threatening a draw after bishop captures on g6 and rook captures on g6. The queen will be able to make a repetition of moves. After c4, white tries to delay that by playing bishop to e4, but after d3 it decides that might as well just go for it. And although here black is a rook up in material, the king has an inescapable perpetual check, and they both claim the draw. So, as we can see here, if we have a look at the head-to-head record, it's 2 wins for Ding Liren and 2 draws. So Ding Liren has the advantage here. Ding Liren, although they're on this losing streak, as we've just seen there, an incredibly strong and resilient player. Gukesh has the ability to fight back from losing positions very well, those we saw in that first game, managing to come back from a completely lost position to end up drawing the game. Very, very well played from both of the people here. I'm sure it's going to be a very exciting World Championship. If you'd like, please leave your predictions of who will win in the comments below. Please like and subscribe. As I said, this is my first video, and hopefully there's going to be a lot more videos coming in the future. Please make sure to check me out on social media and stuff along those lines. All these kind of plugs that I'm going to have to do because I want people to actually pay attention to me. Hello. And hopefully you'll be able to tune in next time when I'll be going over some other chess games or chess concepts, or teaching you some stuff about the game. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.